Good evening, everyone. I am Tishya Majumder, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is mythology and its significance in sculpting cultural practices. We are honored to have with us Professor Vamsee Juluri, Professor Brian Collins, Professor Shubha Patak, and Professor Lavanya Vemsani as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Professor Brian Collins is the author of two books on Hindu myth, The Head Beneath the Altar, Hindu Mythology, and The Critic of Sacrifice 2014, and the other Rama, Matricide and Varnicide in the Mythology of Parasurama 2020, and the Doctors Ram and Sushila Gavande Chair in Indian Religion and Philosophy at Ohio University, where he is also the chair of the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. Next, we have Professor Lavanya Vemsani, who is the multi-award-winning scholar and distinguished professor of history at Shawnee State University in the Department of Social Sciences. Vemsani is the honorary visiting professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, in the Department of Historical Studies. She is the editor-in-chief of international journal Indic Religions. Her publications include 5 books and numerous articles. Thirdly, we have Professor Vamsee Juluri. Professor Vamsee Juluri is a professor of media studies at the University of San Francisco. His books include The Mythologist, a novel, Bollywood Nation, India Through Its Cinema, Rearming Hinduism, and Saraswati's Intelligence and the Firekeepers of Jwalapuram, books 1 and 2 of the Human Trilogy, The Kishkinda Chronicles. And fourthly, we have Professor Shubha Patak. Shubha Patak, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion, American University, is a historian of religions who researches and teaches about myths originating in India, Greece, and Rome. Having edited a 2013 volume, Figuring Religions, Comparing Ideas, Images, and Activities, and having authored a 2014 monograph, Divine Yet Human Epics, Reflections of Poetic Rulers from Ancient Greece and India. She especially is interested in the interrelationships of epics and their cultures. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. I request Professor Vamsee Juluri to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening. Uh, I find myself a little disoriented because it's still early in California. But I guess since we are talking about perennial topics, I will do my best to awaken my inner sun, even though the sun is yet to rise here. Uh, so I have just written a few ideas and I will share them the panel and our viewers today. uh, Mythology and its significance in sculpting cultural practices. So that's our title. Uh, I would like to frame my talk, though, with a slight tweak on the title of a panel and call it simply How Do We Talk About Living with Our Gods? I think there's an echo somewhere.
I request all the professors to please mute your mics while one person is speaking.
Thank you. Yeah. Uh, how do we talk about living with our gods? And then a parenthesis. How do we talk about living with our gods, especially when everybody else thinks that the gods have fallen or worse, have done something gravely wrong by not falling, despite all our efforts to outlive them? So that's just my slightly complicated way, I suppose, of saying I want to recognize that there are limits to our vocabulary here when we use a label like mythology for a world that refuses to follow the rules that we humans, academics, whatever, set. Okay. All right. So Contemporary cultural practices. So, obviously, there are academics and a whole new generation of artists and writers who are reimagining the goddesses and gods as characters in novels, cartoons, memes, especially memes about politics. And all of them have accepted, obviously, a certain contemporary belief or maybe even dogma that there is no one story. So, everything's a story, and Rama, Krishna, Durga, etc., are just names for us to do with them what we will, for entertainment or commerce or politics, even progressive politics. Okay? And yet, even as we say this, we know somehow that the alternative to one story, one God, one truth isn't to say that all stories are the same. Okay? And to imagine that the gods and goddesses are as flattened caricatures of not just what they represent of us, but dare I say it, also of just what they are, which is gods and goddesses. We might call this yearning to go beyond these choices the hope of the better story, as a novel about a tiger and a boy stuck on a lifeboat together put it, Life of Pi, of course. Or, if I may invoke my own first novel, The Mythologist, as the protagonist, P. Parashuram, puts it. And by the way, The Mythologist is inspired and takes place in the world of the great Telugu mythological movies like Maya Bazar with the great N.T. Ramarao, as well as the 1980s Hollywood classic Clash of the Titans. So, as the protagonist of my novel puts it at the end, some stories are not simply stories. There's something more, obviously. Okay? So, some stories are just not stories, and if I may add, some gods are just not costumes to be put on for a show, like the Hollywood celebrity who was Kali for Halloween, or the comedic Shiva chased around the toilet by a supposedly secular and humanistic Bollywood alien. What I suppose I want us to think about then is really the flip side of our panel's topic, too. What is the current state of some of our cultural practices when it comes to what is called mythology? Some of us are writing novels using Shiva, Rama, Sita, or in my own case, Hanuman as a character. So, this is the Hanuman trilogy or Kishkinda Chronicles. And I will stop with my self promotion on those books. Thank you. So, many of us are writing books about Shiva, Rama, Hanuman, etc. When we do this, what exactly are we doing? Are we interpreting one form of literature, that is Ramayana or Mahabharata, as another form? Or are we also imposing one sensibility on another one simply because we've inherited certain kinds of colonial and post colonial privileges that allow us to do so, like writing in English, operating for a global entertainment audience rather than, say, ancestrally, culturally rooted one? So, those are some of the questions that I think about as I work through this trilogy. And when I started writing this, I guess I was less informed or less aware of some of these sensitivities. But now, as I find myself somewhat stuck between book two and book three of this trilogy, I am certainly thinking about what liberties or what authority I have, to write about Hanuman, even if this is a fictional imagining. So I'm not saying necessarily that every time we reinterpret something, we are doing something bad, because there have been cultural creators like Dada Saheb Phalke or B.N. Reddy and Chakrapani, who founded the great Chandamama magazine, or Uncle Pai of Amar Chitrakada, who all worked in new cultural forms and with new cultural idioms. And when the audience saw the name or face of Krishna or Ganesha, whatever sensibility it is that when you see Krishna or Ganesha, you want to put your hands together in a pranam and you find yourself smiling very, very happily. So that still prevails. And that is, I think, a mystery that media studies is yet to solve. So, to summarize, um, and to leave us with some questions to think about, in just about 100 years, that is, say, 3 or 4 generations, the creative practices around mythology have gone from stage to cinema to magazine to comic book to TV shows to animated spin offs and to all kinds of epic novels. For some today, the gods they see in these new mass mediated forms with all their new angles and experiments, are the only forms in which they have seen them. Okay? Naturally, they see these purely through this category called myth or mythology as a genre of entertainment. Okay? But for some others, the gods are in these new forms, but they're also in the forms in which their parents, grandparents, elders, ancestors all adored them in temples, in sculptures, in voices and songs, in dreams and longings, in crises and happiness, in all of life as we know it and are yet to know. And though as we get older, we realize we are not here forever, I think we also recognize that the consequences of our time here does tend to live on after us, whether it's for the planet and Mother Nature, or for our children and future generations, or for us, whether we want to call it karma or I don't know what to call it. But given the realities of how limited our knowledge is of our life and existence when we begin, and how inevitable so many things are, I think it is comforting and illuminating in so many ways to know that there is something eternal and that the gods are eternal. So, to conclude, Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati, these names and forms dance from eternity and make the present feel alive, and they make us feel well to be a part of this eternity. Our words and us, meanwhile, make do with finitudes, where, thank God, I might say, we still have our beloved myths. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was a very enlightening discussion. I now request Professor Brian Collins to please present your views on today's topic.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm very happy to be on a panel with such distinguished panelists. And I guess what I wanted to do is talk about what I think a myth is, and how my idea of what a myth is influences the way I read myths, because ultimately we do impose our ideas on whatever it is that we encounter, whether it's in our own backyard or something we find in an ancient text. And that's the only way in which we can make sense of it, is through this overlap of horizons between what we have to work with mentally and what we find out in the world. So to me, a myth is a narrative. It's always has to be a narrative. There's all sorts of ways to symbolize things. You can use arts, you can use dance, and all of these we see in India. But a myth is got to be a narrative to me. It can be surrounded by other forms, but that's the primary form of a myth. And it has to be about events that aren't either witnessed by the person who's telling the myth or by the people who are listening to the myth. So they have to be about events that happened outside of it doesn't need to be in the distant past necessarily, but it has to be something that doesn't have any eyewitnesses in the room. That's the importance of a myth. That's the difference between a myth and what's called a memorit in folkloric studies, which is somebody tells a story about something that happened to them that may in fact be a piece of folklore, like the Phantom Hitchhiker is a famous one in the United States, picking up a hitchhiker who disappears suddenly, and you find out that it was a ghost. That's called a memorit if it happened to you. But myths can't be memorits. They have to have happened outside of the experience of the teller and the audience in some other place. And they have to have more than one variant. They can't just have one version. They have to have at least two, but often and almost always many more different versions of the myth out there, all of which would come into play for the hearers and the tellers. And what myths do, well, they're narratives about events not witnessed by the teller or the audience. They exist in more than one variant, and they express the values and the anxieties and the worldview, which is shared by the group of people who receive it and reproduce it. So a myth expresses three things: values, anxieties, and worldview. So values are the things that the teller and presumably the audience find to be important. This could be family. It could be aesthetic beauty. It could be philosophical profundity. But they symbolize, or they make clear, what is supposed to be important: honor, dignity, masculinity, whatever. but they also express the flip side of that, the anxieties, things that people feel are either dangers or resources that are running low, like power among the powerless, or anxieties about the future or even the immediate present are expressed in myths, or can be expressed in myths, even if they're, sometimes you have to look for them, but the anxieties are typically there. That's what drives the myth and makes it more than just a banal description of some events, is that it has some anxiety behind it, something that can be resolved or at least addressed. And those two things add up to a worldview, but a worldview is more than just values and anxieties. It's a whole sort of coherent picture of the world and our place in it. So all those things are expressed in a myth. Now, the worldview isn't expressed in its fullest form. This is, of course, what we call a calque, or a direct translation of the German Weltanschauung. And in English, we take it to mean the big picture. And you can't tell the big picture all at once, which is my myths exist in the context of other myths and other social forms. You get the big picture over time through osmosis and also through listening to stories. So when we read an ancient Greek myth, we're trying to, in some sense, reconstruct the worldview of those of the people who made the myth. Same thing with an ancient Sanskrit myth or Tamil, Telugu, some Middle Indo-Aryan dialect. And we know that it's a different worldview from our own, but if we can understand it, then there's a point of commonality. If it's completely alien to us, we can, I guess, misunderstand it. But what myth shows us is that we do have some commonality with people by understanding their worldview through their myths. So, but myths don't stay the same. That's why we have so many variants of them. So it seems like, from my definition, that they would be conservative, that they would reinforce what people thought were valuable, what people were anxious about, and people's overall worldview. But in fact, they exist in a mutually influential relationship with the societies whose values and anxieties and worldviews they express. So which is to say, as those values change, the myths are reshaped. So there's a important observation made by a guy named Hans Blumenberg in about 1985, is when the book was published in English anyway. He characterizes myths as stories that are distinguished by a high degree of constancy in their narrative core and by an equally pronounced capacity for marginal variation. So in the core of the myth, the basic story of the myth, the skeleton of the myth, is easily recognizable throughout time, but it has a capacity for almost infinite variations at the edges. So the story of Krishna and Radha, right, was told again and again. It was a subject of plays, of dance, of poetry, most famously perhaps, but also Bollywood films, comic books. We always know the story of the lovers and their quarreling, but a lot of things about it can change, and we can still recognize it as the story of Krishna and Radha, or you can multiply that with any other examples. And that's what makes a myth different from a plot, like a story plot or a novel plot. Once it goes through enough changes, you can recognize it as a genre of story, like a mystery or whodunit or a romance, but it doesn't have anything necessarily in common with other narratives like it, other than belonging to the same genre. Whereas a myth's core story is going to stay the same. You can see Krishna with different names, Radha with different names, but you recognize the story of Radha and Krishna, not just any old romance. So when we listen to and when we reproduce myths, we're participating in this practice. We're reinforcing values. Sometimes we're also challenging values. We are expressing anxieties. Sometimes we are challenging, or rather trying to allay those anxieties about the future, about identity, about the present. And we are continuing to build the worldview. So the worldview isn't something that's out there that a myth expresses. It's something that a myth also helps to create every time that it's told. So when, the famous saying is that no Indian ever hears the Mahabharata for the first time, what people mean by that is that it is so permeates the culture and the air sort of that you breathe, because it is so embedded in the worldview and because it is so important to expressing that worldview. So when I think of a myth, I think of a story that has a lot of importance because of those things. So it's a tool for us to understand the way people think about the world. We can't understand how people felt or thought when they created that myth, but we really can't necessarily understand how people felt or thought when they wrote a poem last week. We can only make our best guess by taking what we know and measuring it against what we see expressed in the myth. Not necessarily measuring against, that's probably not the best way to put it, but there has to be some fusion of horizons. We have to have some way of identifying with them, with their point of view, with the storytellers and the audiences, or else they would be completely inexplicable to us. They would be meaningless to us if we didn't have a commonality that would allow us to read it. So the commonality allows us to read it. The differences allow us to read it productively. And I don't want to take up too much time because I want to hear from the other columnists. I know there are some questions, so I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. It was wonderful to hear you speak. I would now request Professor Shubha Patak to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone who's made this wonderful panel possible. It's great to be here, whatever time zone we're in. So I took our topic, mythology and its significance in sculpting cultural practices, quite literally. I'm interested here in talking about a couple of mythological portrayals of sculptures, actually, that illustrate some of the coping strategies that I think epic authors are assuming that their audiences can try to follow in dealing with sudden loss, some of the problems associated with losing someone important in your life. So the two examples I'm going to talk about focus on two kings, and I'm focusing first on the Ramayana, and I'm focusing on Rama, and the mostly Vishnu-worshipping Brahmins who authored the Ramayana were interested in promoting the ideal of unrelenting righteousness, or dharma, of the epic's main character, and they don't really allow him to indulge his sorrow for very long. So even though Rama in the books, in the epic's 7th section, is faced with the loss of his wife Sita, she has gone into the earth, and Rama, being half of Vishnu reborn on earth, nonetheless is human, and he's continually perturbed. He's very sad. He sees the world as being barren. But yet he continues on, and he goes on to perform numerous sacrificial rites. And there's actually a sculpture of Sita made of gold who presides over these rites. She's sitting there, she's present for them. And Rama never remarries. So the narrative then jumps to a description of how Rama talks about, or Rama, in his capacity as king of Kosala, rules his land for 10,000 years. And he never sees Sita again while he's alive. She has actually, at this point, merged with the goddess Lakshmi, or Shri, and Lakshmi being Vishnu's wife, of course. And so by the time Rama decides himself to embark on his journey to heaven, Shri, or Lakshmi, comes down and comes and accompanies him on the journey. And so at that point, she has already incorporated Sita, the human manifestation of the goddess, within her. So at this point, then, I think it's useful to contrast this narrative with a later narrative. So this is the story that we get in the Ragamosha. This is an epic by Kalidasa, who was a Shiva worshiper. And as a result, even though he was employed by Gupta emperors who were Vishnu worshippers, he didn't have the same outlook necessarily on Rama and his family. So, I mean, he honored his employers. He definitely portrayed Rama as having a divine connection, although he makes Rama only 1/4 of Vishnu, like the rest of his brothers. He's not especially more fractionally than they are. And he ends up, Kalidasa, exploring, instead of dharma so much, the topic of kama, or desire. And he focuses on Rama's grandfather, Aja. And Aja, in the Raghuvamsha's 8th canto, loses the love of his life, Indumati. And we know that they are close, because she actually has gone through one of the rare instances of an actual Swayamvara, an actual marital self-choice ceremony. She actually decides whom she wants to marry, and she chooses Aja. And this is a contrast with Sita's Swayamvara, because Sita in that ceremony actually was going to be awarded to whoever won, or whoever mastered the bow of Shiva as set forth as a challenge by her father Janaka. And so what we see then when Aja loses Indumati is this immense sorrow, and he manages to stay on the throne for an additional 8 years. He does this to rear to adulthood his son, Dasharatha, who's going to go on to father Rama. And he finds not only some respite, I think, from his grief in his dreams. He has vivid dreams of his wife Indumati and enjoys spending time with her in the dreams. But he also, in his private life, has occasion to view an exact replica of her in sculpture. And that artwork, I think, plays an important role in his recovery journey. And so once Dasharatha has grown up and is ready to assume the throne, Aja, who's not particularly attached to his current life, he's sick by this point, he still misses Indumati terribly, he gives up his life by ritual fasting, and upon his death is able to reunite with Indumati. They end up reuniting in the heavenly pleasure garden of Nandana. So in examining the contrast between these two widowers, I take my interpretative cues from these sculptures, the differences between these sculptures. And so I think the golden Sita, who is simply described as that, the golden Sita, the golden Janaki in the text, she is actually primarily there as an object to serve a ceremonial purpose. She's presiding over these sacrifices. She's sort of reminding the people, or the object is reminding the people of the loss of this queen who's no longer there to fulfill her ritual functions. And it's similar to the fact that, or it's in line with the fact that Rama himself, as a king, has put his people's needs ahead of his own needs, his familial needs, and that's a pattern we see throughout the Ramayana. But I think the more vividly depicted sculpture of Indumati, which is described as having a very close resemblance to the queen, offers the audience and offers Aja a chance for an actual emotional connection, a kind of aesthetic appreciation. And it provides him with some solace away from his dream encounters, a way to kind of separate himself from his unconscious working through of his sorrow for his wife, and a way to kind of physicalize, to make concrete the pain that he's going through as he works his way through that sorrow. And I think the differences between these two texts help us understand two different ways to cope with grief, which unfortunately many of us have had to do often in recent times. And so this question, I think, of how to get through, I think Rama demonstrates this sort of public side of this. You know, we do what we need to do. We do what's best for the people around us. We take others' needs into account, and we think about our society. But Aja's example shows that people need to think about their own grief as well, to have a sort of compartment for it, separate from their public life, a private space where they can actually sit and have some kind of emotional connection with their sorrow made concrete. I think that's what, to me, that sculpture represents. And so I think what we see here is something that reflects the differences in the authorships of these two epics. The Ramayana is a collectively authored epic written by a group of many Brahmanas, primarily Vishnu worshippers, as I've said. And as a result, they're interested in promoting dharma. They're interested in promoting the divinity of Vishnu as Rama, or at least half of Vishnu as Rama. And later storytellers, of course, like Tulsidas, are going to expand on the divinity of Rama. But at this point, he's still human. He's half of Vishnu reborn. But in any case, this is a response. His response to Sita's loss, or the loss of Sita, is a kind of collective response. It's a response that takes into account the needs of the society versus above the individual. Whereas the individually authored Ragamosha provides a remedy that prioritizes the concerns of the individual over society. This is a case where an individual makes time to grieve and to have a proper emotional reaction, I think, that's portrayed in the epic. So I think finally, just to end, I think that shows us that we have two very different kinds of epics here as well. So this epic, the Ramayana, which promotes dharma and this kind of societal orientation, is what I would call a normative epic. It's promoting social norms of some sort. Whereas I think the Ragamosha is what I would call an amatory epic, something that is focused on emotional connection, in this case, love, kama, and thinking about how to fulfill one's desires and to flourish amid the challenges that life brings. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this brilliant presentation. I now request Professor Lavanya Vemsani to please present your views on today's topic.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone. Happy Navratris and Dasara. I am thrilled to speak today as we celebrate the 10 divine days and 9 nights of the goddess. I will speak about the links between life and culture, since the stories of our epics are never completely separated from life. We'll focus more on feminine aspects of our divine epics. Indian culture preserves the most fascinating tales of women. The Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Puranas described tales of women. My research in the past decade has resulted in 2 books, The Feminine Journeys of the Mahabharata and Krishna in History, Thought and Culture. Both of them examine feminine divine and feminine heroic very closely. My examination of the women showed that women of early modern world depicted in our texts are heroic and showed freedom of choice and conduct. They are inspirational even though their life is so distant. Unfortunately, early scholarly studies have failed to bring out the legendary lives of the goddesses and heroic women depicted in the epics and the Puranas, as they focused on 3 unsuitable aspects for the study. Categorizations, sexuality, excessive focus on sexuality, and psychoanalysis, a modern theory that's not applicable to the ancient world and ancient life. So the categorizations shows misogyny and frequently devolved into coining derogatory terminology with regard to goddesses and heroic women. They call the goddesses mother goddess and spouse goddess, dividing them into categories based on the status of their marriage, as if that's the only feature that distinguishes the goddesses. And then they started calling the mother goddesses as breast goddess and others as tooth goddesses. Some call the goddesses as wild goddesses and such. So this derailed the actual understanding of goddesses for some time. And this also percolated into understanding the feminine heroic. We can only understand the true nature of the goddesses and heroics only when we moved beyond these categorizations. Therefore, in my book, Feminine Journeys of the Mahabharata, I examined the stories of 11 legendary women who help bring out our cultural understanding of the feminine divine and feminine heroic, the feminine in general. As we see here, the misogyny comes from scholarly studies, not from the stories of the goddesses themselves. My study of the legendary women of the Mahabharata showed that the women have undertaken impossible journeys and completed them successfully. Heroic women such as Satyavati, Kunti, Draupadi, and Madhavi showed the freedom of choice and strength of feminine to wade through difficult life. Divine feminine such as Durga, Ganga, Urvashi, Subhadra showed the transformative life of the feminine and human sphere, within human sphere, and for mortals like us, because they embraced the earthly life. While special are the blessed women, such as Savitri, Damayanti, and Amba. Their journeys or transformations went beyond one life or one world. but the feminine heroic have emerged victorious to become worshipful. Their journey showed the impossible is possible in this world. Savitri traveled to the world of Yama to bring the life of her husband Satyavan. Savitri's mastery of yoga and her journey to the world of Yama represents the mastery of mind, the ultimate conscious, represented in the Mandukya Upanishad. The Mandukya Upanishad explains the three letters A, U, no, A, U, Ma that constitute the Om are the three letters of the mind. The A represents the waking state of mind. U represents the dream state of mind, the ultimate deep sleep, while Ma represents the dreamless state, which is beyond the wakeful and sleeping or dream states of mind. As an accomplished yogi who performed the vow of 3 nights of standing and fasting, Savitri showed the power of mind and the stateless ultimate conscious. When she met Yama, she is in this ultimate conscious, in this mind that is stateless, ultimate conscious. And she was able to follow Yama and obtain the life of her husband back. Similarly, Damayanti traveled the dark depths of mind to rescue her husband Nala from the clutches of invisible enemy Kali, the god of Kali Yuga. Amba is another important story, inspirational story. Amba traveled not just 2 lives, but 2 genders to take her revenge on Bhishma. She died burning with anger to be reborn as transgendered man Shikandi to accomplish the task of killing Bhishma. These stories are truly legendary in showing that the impossible is possible. I can go on and on about the accomplished legendary women of our epics and how they influence our culture through festivals and practices. But I would stop here since there are questions for us to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this illuminating discussion. So now we will begin our question answer session. My first question is to Professor Vamsu Juluri. With special reference to your book, Bollywood Nation, India, through its cinema, could you elaborate on how mythological films contribute to the conceptualization of nation, nationality, and patriotism? Sir, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, the first chapter of Bollywood Nation was entitled God, because while I attempted to write a brief history of India through its cinema, it seemed a natural place to start with, because from the 1930, from around 1913 and Raja Harishchandra, for the next 20, 30 years, the mythological genre was the dominant one. And I particularly wanted to address this issue in this book because I happen to come from the Telugu lands, and my mother used to act in movies, and she has herself acted in many mythological movies. Uh, I wanted to represent a little bit about what remained for at least 1 or 2 more generations in our cultural industries after Bombay and many of the other, Hindi and other film industries forgot about this genre, or at least put it on the back burner. So, in the 1950s, 60s, and even in the 70s, you had the top stars in the Telugu industry, and I think to a certain extent Kannada and Tamil also, acting these stories in these stories. So that was a childhood memory. It was a part of my childhood experience growing up. But what I discovered about modern Indian history in relation to this genre, which addresses your question, is the fact that many of these movies, especially in the silent era, were quietly expressing the mood of the time, which was very patriotic, which was, calling for independence from British colonial rule. And I think there was one incident in particular that I read about a movie called Bhakta Vidur, which actually was sort of censored by the British authorities because the actor who played Vidura from the Mahabharata, the wise elder, resembled Gandhi. So I wondered about how many such, incidents might have happened in these old movies, many of which are unfortunately lost to us today. But I could certainly see, in the saint movies like Bhakta Tukaram in the 30s, or the many movies made by the great Telugu elder Nagaya Garu, all the saint movies clearly were expressing, some of the egalitarian ideals of the time, as well as, ideals of, of freedom. So I think, um, well, in the context of today's discourse on nationalism, um, I have to just say that things are a little more complex today. So I'm very wary of, excuse me, attempts to peg what, I guess, Hinduism into nationalistic context too much. Whether it is in the case of the politics that are unfolding in India, or even in the case of the diaspora in the US, where, for example, there is this discourse about the label, Hindu American, that may have its places here and there, but for the most part, I think when we invoke the stories of our gods, or the names of our gods, or the forms of our gods, the nation is like a footnote. That's the way I see it.
So these mythological films do stand as a foundation for the future generations to get a glimpse of our nation and patriotism, right?
Absolutely, and much more, and much more.
Much
That's what
more,
I.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. My second question is to Professor Brian Collins. Focusing on instances from your book, The Head Beneath the Altar, Hindu Mythology and the Critique of Sacrifice, could you shed some light on how the rituals of animal sacrifice were practiced in ancient India as opposed to contemporary India, where curbing animal cruelty is an ongoing effort?
Oh, thanks for asking this question. This was a question that I actually prepared to answer, so I got lucky here. This is a really interesting question. I like this. So there's a line in the Aitareya Brahmana, which is a Brahmana of the Rig Veda, that says that the sacrificial victim shall be divided into 36 parts because the Brahati meter consists of 36 syllables. And then it says, by dividing it this way, the victim is made into a celestial being, whereas those who proceed in another way tear it apart like rogues or criminals. So in the sacrificial literature, there's a real attention to doing things in a certain way, especially when it comes to killing. And of course, fairly early on, the killing gets removed from the sacrificial arena and taken to the edges, to the outer boundaries, to the yupa, and is done in the horse sacrifice anyway, in a bloodless fashion before the dismemberment of the animal. And so I think it would be anachronistic to say there was really a concern for ethics as we think of them here, but there was clearly a discomfort with the act of killing, and especially its consequences for the killer, and therefore they're making great pains to distinguish what they do, the sacrificial killing of an animal, from the killing of an animal for any other purpose. And of course, throughout the ancient world, people would get their meat through sacrificial offerings, which is why a lot of Christians in the Roman Empire didn't eat it, because it came from having been offered to pagan gods and then consumed by the worshippers. So the ancient Indian rituals of sacrifice did demand the sacrifice of animals, but then later, as that became forbidden by purity rules, they came up with substitutions. And the interesting thing about the system of Indian sacrifice is that substitution is fairly easy to do, because it's the parts can be switched out with each other and the ritual stays the same. So they lost soma before they even entered North India, and it didn't matter one bit. They could still perform all the soma rituals without the actual soma plant, which was somewhere on a mountain in Yugoslavia or something. So likewise, animal sacrifice could be taken out and the ritual was left unchanged. But then, of course, there are other sources for animal sacrifices as practiced today in India, maybe from indigenous, maybe from Munda practices that pre-existed before Aryans came in, maybe from something that happened in the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. But there are non-Hindu sources for the kind of sacrifices we see in Shakti cults, for instance. However, there's also a lot of evidence that for a long time, Vedic ritualism has influenced how those developed too. There's a great study by Madeleine Biardot about remnants of Vedic ritual and buffalo sacrifices in South India. So you get, on the one hand, a movement away from animal sacrifice with the Brahmanic ritual, and then the retention of it in goddess worship and other forms that aren't Brahmanic. And then you get this debate about modern killing of animals, which I think is a totally different thing. There's the killing of animals in a sacrificial enclosure demands people, especially reflective people like the Brahmins were, to think about it and to examine it and to try to comprehend its meaning. Whereas the mechanized killing of animals in a slaughterhouse requires no thought at all and almost no human involvement beyond putting them through the door. So there's a real dissociation between people who eat meat that is taken from animals who are slaughtered out of their vision and come to them packaged or already cooked, and those who have to actually be with the victim of the sacrifice, and also to see themselves in the victim of the sacrifice, which everyone performing a Vedic ritual would do. So I think there is a productive way to rethink animal killing through the way that Brahmins thought of it in the commentarial literature. There's all sorts of ethical and an ecological, which is becoming more of an issue. I mean, this is a big part of a country's carbon footprint, is how much meat it consumes, also water through that. So I actually think there's a opportunity here to look at old texts and examine modern practices in light of them in maybe a way that would be productive.
So the best solution in this case would be to replace the animals with some other non-living item and keeping the rest of the ritual exact same. And that can be encouraged throughout the country.
Right. Well, I think about this where, so there's the 1976 Altar Fire documentary about a Vedic fire sacrifice in Agni Chayana in Kerala, and they chop up wrapped up banana leaves instead of goats. And then I think about how people have replaced animal products with vegetable products in a lot of pseudo meat products, and especially in places like Europe and America. And this is something that comes from the Vedic ritual. You say you can make something else stand in for the animal, and there's no killing involved, and the thing pretty much stays there. You can have a hamburger, if it's an Impossible Burger, a Beyond Burger, without killing an animal, just like the Vedic ritualists could sacrifice a goat by sacrificing a banana leaf.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. My next question is to Professor Shubha Patak. With instances from your book, Divine Yet Human Epics, Reflections of Poetic Rulers from Ancient Greece and India, could you tell us about how epic poems from the classical Indian period contributed in enriching the Indian academic and literary realm?
Sure. So I think the thing that I find interesting, especially interesting about these classical Indian epics, is that they have a tendency to reflect on their own reason for existing. So what we see in both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana is we have figures of poets who essentially demonstrate to us what the value of such epic poetry is. And so in the Mahabharata, for example, the mythological author of the text, Vyasa, ends up giving divine vision to Sanjaya, who's a charioteer bard. He's the narrator of the Bhagavad Gita. And he, at that point, has the ability to view things that he basically attains a kind of clairvoyance. He's able to see things from afar. So this relates back to what Professor Collins was talking about, I think, with myth not necessarily being not being something that people can view visually, because this Sanjaya, when he's reciting the myth he's reciting basically the battle books of the Mahabharata, books 6 through 9. And what he's doing there is essentially using this extraordinary vision, this divine vision, to recount for the blind king Dhritarashtra what is happening on the battlefield, because Dhritarashtra can't see it himself and doesn't want to see it himself, actually. He refuses the gift of divine vision and has his charioteer bard Sanjaya do this for him. So what Sanjaya, I think, represents is epic's capacity to present to us a vivid, a kind of immediacy in the text that allows us to see with clear eyes what is happening at a given moment. And so Sanjaya does this well because he's basically able to narrate the events of the epic as they're unfolding, but he's not right there. He's distant from them. And the only reason he knows what's going on is because he's been given this special type of perception. But in the Ramayana, I think we have a different kind of temporal relationship here, because what happens is that we have the entire epic narrated to us by Rama's twin sons, Kusha and Lava. And coincidentally, not coincidentally, certainly not coincidentally, a Kushi Lava in this time period is a particular type of poetic reciter who has basically taken somebody else's composition and is reciting it. And so similarly, Kusha and Lava are the students of Valmiki, the mythological author of the Ramayana. And they are basically telling their father Rama everything that has happened to him up to this point and everything that will happen to him in the future. So their recitation is the bookends, forms the bookends for the telling of the Ramayana. So I think for this epic, what we see as a kind of self-representation is epic's capacity to both look to the past and look ahead to the future. And so in this sense, I think these epics do a good job of sort of explaining to us why we should take heed, why we should pay attention, because they have the capacity to be everything, to sort of encompass what happens in all points in time.
So we can say that these epics are self-explanatory in some ways.
I think they try to create, even though they're aware of other things in their universe, aware of other texts, I think they do try to sort of create their own sort of unitary vision that is maybe not completely self-sufficient, but at least there's a kind of meaning that they give to themselves that stands alone, I think.
Thank you, ma'am. My fourth question is to Professor Lavanya Vemsani. With special reference to your article, Sita, Feminine as Nature in the Story of Ramayana, could you shed some light on how the portrayal of women in mythologies question the prevalence and practices of patriarchy in the human society and also encourage women to resist gender discrimination?
Thank you. The term nature stands here for Prakriti. Women are Shakti. Sita is equated with Shakti in Hindu understanding of theology. So, of course, Shakti is the energy, the strength, the pulsating form of creation. So that's what we see in the story of Sita. And the way she conducted herself, she takes on many challenges and stands up for herself and what she thinks is right. Shubha has talked about the Swayamvara. Of course, the Swayamvara is about stringing the bow of Shiva, Shiva Dhanus. However, Ramayana, Valmiki is careful to narrate that Sita has seen Rama while he was coming to the Swayamvara as he was coming, and then she gave his heart to him. So that's her choice. It's her choice that, you know, the joining of the Prakriti and Purusha, that's what gave the strength to lift Shiva's bow. Shiva's bow could only be lifted and strung, but could not be shot. If it is shot, it's the end of the age, the pralaya. So the story also depicts Rama only lifting it and stringing it, and then depicts it as breaking. So Valmiki is writing with a clear conscience of understanding of Shakti and Purusha and how the cosmological ideas of Hinduism worked. It's a small episode, but represents the Hindu understanding of life. And at the same time, the later episodes of Sita's life, how she conducted herself, right? She wants to go to the forest with Rama when he was, he was given the Vanvas. Of course, Rama tells her the perils of the forest. These are the difficulties. You don't have all these luxuries, all these silk clothes, and of course, that's okay for her because she's not with him for the luxuries. She's with him for being with him. It's this union of this ultimate Purusha and Prakriti. And this ultimate Purusha and Prakriti, of course, goes on, and the determination is with Sita. So the events that happen are determined by Sita. Of course, she goes, she faces her difficulties, and she was kidnapped by Ravana. We all know that, and of course, Ravana could not force her. He kidnapped her, but she would not enter his palace, or she would not succumb to his demands. So that also shows the strength and determination of Sita. Of course, when she was coming back, she is asked to do the Agni Pariksha, and she is willing to do it. You give one chance to anyone. So she gives this to the Purusha that she has chosen, and she does it. Of course, that again shows the determination of the Prakriti, the strength of the Prakriti. And they come back, and of course, she's put through another one was by herself again. And the children become, 12-year-old, and they come singing the bardic tale of Ramayana. That's how the Ramayana comes to us. But she stays by herself in the forest. She raises the children by herself, and then when she was asked a second time, of course there is no second time, so she stands up and takes her own end of life decision, and she returns to the earth from where she came. And here, earth and the essence of earth is always depicted as Lakshmi. So the identification of Lakshmi with Sita, of course, takes form here, as she is depicted as the wife of daughter of earth. The Upanishads, actually in the Vedas, the essence of the earth, the wealth, is actually depicted as wealth that was presented at the wedding of Surya's daughter. So this type of references are found, how the essence of earth is understood as wealth and Lakshmi. So Lakshmi identified a number of times with incarnations. The Lakshmi's incarnations are not as elaborately studied as Vishnu's incarnations are studied, but the symbolism is there. So in this tale of Sita, I see both symbolism of Lakshmi as essence of the earth, as wealth. At the same time, I also see the symbolism of Prakriti, the spontaneous decisions, the strength of standing up for the decisions. The Prakriti is depicted in the nature of her conduct, the way she conducts herself in this, in her journey.
So Sita stands strong and fierce and is definitely an inspiration to all the young women today.
Yes. There was a survey conducted in the 80s when I was still in my college days. And they asked, actually, the three women protagonists, which one do you choose to be your inspiration? So Draupadi, Radha, and Sita. Sita won by a far margin. So I would still say that still stands.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My next question is to Professor Vamsu Juluri. We see a lot of mythologies available in the form of cartoons and animation movies, which really appeal to children. How, in your opinion, do such shows build children's perception of reality and moral values?
Yeah, thank you. I think there is, a certain amount of epistemic confusion because of the general glut of media in the past 20 or 30 years. I'm not sure if this happened on the same scale till the 1980s or so. Because if you look at, mythology or religion or knowledge traditions, all of these in terms of intergenerational learning and negotiation, um, you know, the generation that was born in India and grew up from the 1990s onwards, into, you could call it the liberalization generation, or the millennials as they're called here, and the generation after, the Gen Z as it's called, they are simply surrounded by a lot more content, and um, I think that there is we see the beginning of a certain amount of confusion in terms of how they understand these things. Now, it is a very peculiar problem because as far as I know, we have not historically had organizations, like the 1622 College of Propaganda established by Pope Gregory, to enforce or propagate, one story. There have always been many stories, but I think there have been unifying sensibilities in terms of the aesthetic and ethical priorities involved. So you may consume Rama or Krishna in the form of an Amar Chitrakada comic next to your Indrajal comic or Mandrake or Bahadur or Phantom, but you would not have confused the two because you also saw Rama and Krishna in your parents or grandparents temple prayer room at home or in a temple. So I think the two sensibilities held each other. There was a merging of horizons, as Brian put it earlier, right? So you held the creative, popular, contemporary, also with the ancestral, traditional forms of worship. I think post 90s that has started to blur a little bit, and a lot of reasons for that. So to give us one concrete example, if you think of the example of Chota Bheem, right, which also became merchandising, or the little stuffed toy Hanumans that started to come. So I think the last 20, 30 years, there is confusion, but that confusion also inevitably leads to curiosity among children, and as they grow up, about what is actually happening, perhaps. So I think there is an opportunity for more conversations like this, where children can be encouraged to just pay attention to the different ways in which the gods and the stories of the gods exist. And while we can have space for the entertainment aspect of it, there are whole worldviews, like Professor Vemsani illustrated a little while ago. Like, Sita is not just a character, but also Prakriti or Shakti. So there are more deeper cosmologies that one can get into. And we can have the academic rigor to talk about these, we can have the entertainment side, but I think we need to come back to um, just the fact that these are names which have stayed a very, very long time with us. And before I forget, I wanted to actually share this one book. It's Names of Gods by Ram Swaroop. This changed my life and also gave me the biggest writer's block ever, because before in the first book of my trilogy, I was able to just write about Hanuman fairly easily, and I enjoyed writing. But now when I think about all the connotations that have gone from one generation to another over hundreds of generations around these names, these forms, these deities. So now I'm very cautious about expressing the next part of my story. So long story short, I think we are at a time where there are multiple worldviews clashing. Some worldviews are being very forcefully promoted, I think because of certain interests or agendas or biases. But in the end, it is my hope that these names, these forms, these stories will help us see, a better way, for the future.
So basically, the different aspects of these mythological stories, as portrayed in movies and shows and cartoons and so on, give children an idea of the whole, right?
They can be. I think
Yeah.
intergenerational conversations are very important about these. Because I think I've also seen parents sometimes use these cartoons or these books as babysitting management devices. So that is something I think parents should avoid doing, if I may offer parental advice here, because you never know what the quality of that particular rendition, that particular comic or storybook or cartoon might be. All stories are not the same. I mean, there's a reason why some representations of these myths are taken very seriously. People love them, and some people just say, "Oh no, it didn't really speak to me." So parents should be involved.
Thank you so much, sir. My next question is to Professor Brian Collins. As Sanskrit is one of the most important elements of Hindu mythologies, could you talk about whether the current underuse of Sanskrit by common people is preventing them from attaining greater mythological knowledge?
I don't think it is. I think Sanskrit is one language in which myths have been told, but it's far from the only one. And because myths, I think what's important about them is that they have variations and that they have different historical versions, then there is no version of a myth that is ultimately authoritative, whether it's in Sanskrit or not. I mean, the fact is a lot of these myths have deeper origins that are we call Indo-European. We see shared themes with the Greek and the Norse and Roman and the Irish and the Persian mythos. So I think it's good to learn Sanskrit. I think for all sorts of reasons, but I think that, I mean, we've been talking about how myths are still permeating the world today in popular culture, and that's the myth. Those are still the myths. That's why they're myths, because they're able to do that. So I don't think it necessarily harms people's ability to understand myth.
And due to the presence of so many translations and other forms of media that provide these mythological stories, so even though Sanskrit is not kind of underused now, it's not really a problem anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's some myths that are very hard to get without. I mean, like the Vedic myths, which are very fragmentary, and the way you translate them makes a big difference. But those aren't the really, really popular. I mean, people aren't talking about the Indra and the Yetis. They're not making cartoons about Indra and the Yetis. But that's a very difficult to understand myth because we have only a little part of it, and we don't even really know what exactly the Yetis are supposed to be, or the Salavarkeyas in that case. So there are some, but those are, I think, more for scholarly interest. But the myths that are culturally significant, they're not tied to a language.
Thank you so much for your answer. My next question is to Professor Shubha Patak. How, in your opinion, do mythological stories serve as models for people to be more human than grandeur? Could you elaborate on this with respect to the sensibilities of the modern societies?
Okay, this is a big question. So I think even exceptional people have to act under external constraints. I think that's sort of the overall message I get from these epics. And especially, I think, the Mahabharata. One of my favorite examples is when Yudhishthira has to play dice with Duryodhana and Shakuni. And so Yudhishthira is the son of Dharma. Duryodhana, Shakuni are these Shakuni and Duryodhana are manifestations. They are asuras. They're demons who embody the most degenerate phases of the one of the most prevalent time cycles in Hinduism. So the system of yugas. So Shakuni embodies the Dwapara Yuga, the age of the deuce, or the age of they're named after throws of dice. And so basically Shakuni is the age of the deuce, and Duryodhana embodies the Kali Yuga. So it's equivalent to the throw of snake eyes today. If you have two dice and you have the lowest value that appears on each die. So these demons essentially are basically going to win in the narrative universe of the Mahabharata, because we're at the point where there's a transition point between the Dwapara and Kali Yugas. That's sort of where we are in mythological time when the events of the epic unfold. And so Yudhishthira, because he himself is half of Dharma, he's the son of Dharma biologically, he has to lose this game no matter what happens. I mean, that's sort of the cosmological requirement of the epic here. But yet he is willing to play and to accept the challenge that's offered before him. And this ties back, I think, to his Varna Dharma, his class duty. He's a Kshatriya, a warrior, and he can't refuse any challenge. This would be seen as unmanly, as cowardly. So of course he's going to defend, his right to compete here. And of course, we all know, those of us who have studied the Mahabharata, that Yudhishthira has a weakness for gambling. So this is his particular flaw or interesting fact, I guess. So in any case, he's going to accept, and it's a kind of, there's I think a kind of courage and bravery that's demonstrated in going into a contest when you know that the odds are stacked against you. I mean, Shakuni is basically cheating. He's not the one, or Duryodhana is not the one who's actually playing. His uncle Shakuni is playing, and the dice are essentially loaded. They're going to constantly come out with this losing throw. So in this sense, Yudhishthira can't help but lose, but yet he's willing to play. And I think that's kind of a good metaphor for our problems of everyday life. I think there's so many insoluble problems that we as people, we as individuals, societies deal with, things like climate change and social prejudice and geopolitical conflicts. I mean, these are intractable issues that can't be resolved easily, and yet we're called upon to step up and do something. And I think that it's incumbent on people to not be paralyzed by the fact or that some of these tasks are so imposing, or some of these problems may seem insurmountable. I think despite that, we still have an obligation to act, to do something. And so I think in that sense, I find Yudhishthira, even if he's going to lose, he's playing the game, and that's I think what we all need to do.
So, like you said, that there are many problems right now, such as climate change. So, even though we know that we might not win against nature or climate or whatever is happening, we are still trying. And that is what mythologies inspire us to do.
I think it's something about being human. I think that there's a constant need. I mean, sometimes pathological need, probably, to exert some control, to exert some mastery over our environment. But on the other hand, this is also what distinguishes us perhaps from some of the other species in the world. You know, we're constantly sort of pushing for the next thing. We're sort of testing boundaries and moving on. We're developing. So in some cases, the development is adverse. You know, it's not always a happy development. But I think part of being human is this constant state of flux and development. And I think one of the interesting things, to me at least, about Hinduism is that there's always sort of a balancing between establishing a kind of permanence in the face of impermanence, and that, of course, is quite different from what Buddhism does, in sort of accepting the radical impermanence. And I think it's interesting to have a world where you have both.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, my last question is to Professor Lavanya Vemsani. How does mythology help in creating social, cultural, and religious identities, and how does that, in return, contribute in developing a sense of the self and the other?
All right. It's a complicated question. So historians, I come from a historical background. So for us, culture and civilization is different. You know, we call culture as a phase before literacy is introduced. So for us, it's, kind of question between orality and literature. But in Indian culture, there is no distinction between orality and civilization. So orality is not part of cultural phase. It's the phase of civilization also. You know, the continued creativity, the continued creation of our stories. and how we represent ourselves is a continuing process, is an ongoing process. We're fortunate that Indian civilization is a long-standing civilization, and this continued process of creativity is a symbol of growing, thriving civilization. So, of course, its culture, its origin is in orality, but it continues to be written, but it still continues to be composed and created in oral phase. So we haven't lost that oral phase. So our culture preserves, even though it's a thriving, living civilization, it preserves its cultural phase and cultural understanding of itself. But the problem is in this kind of a phase that India has entered during colonialism, the phase of understanding our own literature, our own symbols, our own culture has metamorphoses. So because of the way certain symbols and certain modernity is imposed on India, and certain mid-millennial crisis that India faced before the modernity began. So either way, by the time the epics reached us in the 60s and 70s, and new creativity entered and started creating our own film, cartoon, and newer versions of our epics, lots of changes have been already introduced because of the colonialism and mid-millennial crisis we faced from 14th century onwards. So in the process, we have lost the true essence of our culture, true essence of selfhood. Here I have to take Rabindranath Tagore, who has explained this so carefully through his works, in his Gora, in his writings on nationalism, in his lectures also. The mind, so there is no collective mind, there is no collective conscious, collective selfhood for India. Because we lost it because of the transformations we faced between 14th century to 20th century. So if you're asking me about the selfhood, identity, and based on culture, and then creating self and the other, we're in a confused phase. We're in a transitional phase. We're trying to rediscover ourselves. We're trying to rediscover our selfhood. And as Tagore said, unless we really discover our real selfhood, we won't be able to, find what the other is, what us is. So we are still in this confusing phase. And as my fellow panelists here have agreed, many meanings are there, many understandings are there, many, so it's all there, it's all accepted. But we have to come to find our real selfhood, real mind, real conscious. So that hasn't happened yet. We are in modern phase, but we haven't discovered our selfhood. So for a nation that has lost its selfhood, that has a colonized mind, it's impossible to understand the other. It hasn't understood itself. How can it understand the other? We are not able to understand the other. We are actually appropriating and imposing on ourselves symbols and culture that is imported from the West without even understanding what we are doing, which is causing a terrible confusion. The Gen Z, of course, they're blamed, but I'm sorry, we haven't given them the real symbols and real understanding of our culture. So they are a lost generation in India, and what they are facing is so stressful, and I understand that. So we are in a transitional phase, and I'm hoping soon there will be a path for us to discover our selfhood, to have this understanding of social conscious, where we would have a selfhood. We would be able to define ourselves, would be able to define the others. So this is a sorry phase for us, difficult phase.
So it's basically due to colonialism that this confusion is now taking place.
Two phases. We had mid-millennial crisis due to numerous wars from 14th century onwards. We had mid-millennial crisis extending from 14th century onwards to 17th century. And then in the 18th century, we have colonialism. Any culture that faces centuries of oppression is bound to lose its selfhood. It's difficult, and it's still continuing because we haven't come out of it. We haven't come out of the imposed norms and imposed understandings of ourselves. So we don't know what our self is. We don't know what our collective conscious is.
Thank you so much for your answer, ma'am. So with this, we now come to the end of today's session. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Vamsee Juluri, Professor Brian Collins, Professor Shubha Patak, and Professor Lavanya Vemsani for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tishya ji.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.